Hey everybody, welcome to Simulmedia Live. My name is Matt Collins. It's great to have you with us no matter how you're watching. And I really, I want to let you all know it means so much to us that you take time out of your day to join us for conversation. You know, um, I've had conversations with a handful of people here recently asking, what are you doing right now? What are you doing with time that you maybe didn't think you'd have a few months ago? What are you doing now that there's no commute? And I've gotten answers that are all over the gamut. But one of the things that's become very, very apparent is, as I've talked to more and more people, is how many of us are using this time to focus on some notion of self improvement. Totally coincidentally, I swear this, by the way, up and down. My wife enrolled in Babbel's language learning service. She is of French Canadian descent and wanted to use this time to reconnect with her heritage. She grew up in a family not unlike so many, I think, immigrant families from 40, 50 years ago, where the momentum in the family was not to retain the native tongue. It was to learn English and not to raise their children in bilingual households. And so my wife feels as if, understandably, she missed out on this great experience. So she's using Babbel to learn or brush up on French and reconnect with their heritage. And my wife, by the way, is a data point of one, but echoes the experiences of so many. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who is using this opportunity to recommit to understanding what foods he puts in his body and how frequently and intensely he exercises. And so what do we draw from this? Well, the first thing that we should conclude from all of this is that I'm really a slacker because I have not made such a commitment, but I am coming to recognize that I may be in the minority or in a not very substantial majority. But the other thing we should conclude is that some early, perhaps, thoughts or predictions about how people would use a tightened budget in time of recession, when getting food on the table is the priority, maybe we're mistaken, and that more of us were inclined to invest in self-improvement than we could have imagined. And so in observing this trend, and then of course coincidentally seeing my wife pick up Babbel, I felt, well, we better talk to Babbel because they're having a big role to play in this. So I'm so pleased to welcome to Simulmedia Live the US CEO of Babbel, the leading language learning app, Julie Hansen. Julie, thank you so much for joining us in Simulmedia Live. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here, and many thanks to your wife.
I try to remember to say that myself every day. Anyway, so you are in Vermont. Before we get underway, how is your family? How's your team? How are the good employees at Babbel holding up through all this?
The Babbel people of New York are okay. It's not easy. A lot of our folks live in the city, and we're working in pretty tight quarters. But I've actually been really impressed with the way the team has pulled together, kind of doubled down in these past few weeks. Partly, I think it's a little bit the thrill of knowing that you've created a product that people are really embracing at a time like this, like knowing that your product gives people comfort, encouragement, solace, that it's helpful during this time period. That is very motivating. But also, I think we have a great team, and they're holding up okay. The past week, 2 weeks has been even more tumultuous on top of the many weeks that preceded it, and I think that's added another layer of strain. But it's a strong team.
Julie, on that note, have you found over the last 2 weeks, and here I think we're talking about the homicide of George Floyd and all of the unrest that it has stirred and the call to protest that so many people understandably feel. Are you finding that is it clarifying things for the team? Is it giving them another outlet for energy? And here I'll overlay just a Simulmedia point of view, and that is that, I think one consequence of working from home is that it's very easy to have work become utterly dominant. It's so hard to turn it off because our work is our office, is our home. We're surrounded by both family, but also myriad ways of connecting with our work. My sense is that this moment has galvanized my colleagues here in ways that are, I think, have an intrinsic good, because I think it's a galvanizing moment that it would be odd if we weren't reacting to it and thinking about ways that we could all improve and contribute to something that's lasting and durable and better. But it's also very, in this moment, I think for our employees anyway, it's been good to find something that it really does require a lot of energy and thought and purpose that's not work. Are you guys seeing that too?
Well, for sure, it's been impossible not to be focused on what happened, to be focused on the inequity, on the protests. Many of our colleagues are taking part in the protests. So absolutely, that's been, distraction sounds negative, but it's been a focus away from work. And to the extent that we needed something to, yes, good. I think, perhaps we all would have rather had more optimistic, a happier occasion to focus away from work. But yes, a very galvanizing moment, a chance for the team to pull together, to think, to talk about how are we doing, as well as how is the world doing, how are we going to respond to this immediately, but also longer term.
I'm joined today by U.S. CEO of Babbel, the language learning app, Julie Hansen. And however you're watching on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Zoom, if you have a question for Julie about any of the topics we're about to cover today, feel free to ask it. We have eyes on every channel, and we'll be able to get that question in before we adjourn today. Julie, as you and I prepared for this conversation, we went back to the end of 2019 and the start of 2020. And at that time, of course, I don't think any of us could have predicted the shape, and the impact that the pandemic was going to have on the market, and therefore all of our strategies as it related to consumers. But just for the purposes of context, can you briefly describe what was the overarching strategy that you and your team were prepared to execute as you rolled into 2020?
2020 was for us a year about proving out a new strategy. And I'm speaking specifically for the U.S. business, which is focused on sales and marketing in the U.S. So not product vision or anything like that, but sales and marketing. And we had a new creative messaging that we were bringing to market. We had a new KPI system that we were using to evaluate our sales, a very different budgeting process from past years. And it was going to be just a total grind. We knew that this was going to be a hard year, prove out our new strategy. It had a more longer term view to it. And it was not going to be another, rocket ship year of huge growth, because we needed to prove this new strategy. And we were totally ready for that fight. If you've ever rolled out a new messaging platform, it's a lot of work across all of your owned media, earned media, and especially paid media. A lot of work. So that was our struggle. We were ready for that. New team members coming on board. It was going to be a grind, a slow year of proving something out. That's what we thought. We were wrong.
There's a cost to and an effort that I think is commensurate with how much and how successful you've already been. The cost and effort required to turn the ship. And you talk about all the channels that need to be updated, the messaging that needs to be updated. And quite frankly, sometimes the people need to be a bit, to have their own understanding of benefits and positioning and values in the marketplace need to be adjusted. And after what may have been months or even years of being very comfortable messaging in a certain way, suddenly there's, it's a time for change. And I found in my own experience that the more successful in some ways the previous strategy has been in really driving the business, the more effort is required to change it because of all the different moving parts that are suddenly requiring a bit of an adjustment on the dial. So I've been looking forward to hearing you tell the next part of our conversation, which is the moment, and I'm leaping ahead here to pretty much near the end of the first quarter of the year. But here we are at the middle of March, and it felt like to me anyway, in a matter of, 10 days, suddenly everything was changing, including very, very core notions of where and how we were going to all work together. And that was true for you, as I learned in our conversation. But I'd love to have you tell the story to everyone who's watching this. What did you do? What thing you did to convey to every single person on your team in the New York office that this was not a drill? This whole, like, everything that was happening, and all the consequences that it would mean for the way that we work.
Yeah. Well, we, of course, had our pandemic plan in place. We were prepared. Every day we were monitoring the number of cases, and we had a threshold that if things got to that threshold, we were going to go remote. We'd all done various bits of remote work. Funny enough, our office is located, or our old office was located about half a block from the steam pipe explosion. So we were out of the office for a week or so at that point. So we knew how to do it. So every day we're monitoring, and then came March 11, and that was the day that the NBA canceled their season. Tom Hanks revealed that he had COVID, and then the president gave a very alarming on many levels speech about the pandemic. And it came in the next morning. I came in early because I knew it was going to be one of those days. And as everyone walked in, I gave them a giant blue IKEA bag and said, pack it up. And like from the minute they walked in, that was job number one, was to pack up their desks. So by the end of the day, we had 30 IKEA bags or whatever. We ran out of those, but 30 bags, 30 monitors, the big external monitors, about 15 standing desks that some of us like to put on our desks that go up and down, and a few other bits and bobs sitting in a conference room. And we literally were disassembling furniture, throwing stuff out that wasn't going to make the move. People were coming to our office and buying desks and chairs. The team was taking home desks and chairs that wanted them. And that was it. Everyone knew at the end of that day, we were working from home. And it was a very dramatic moment for all of us to come in thinking it's business as usual and leave with your desk in pieces, your stuff in a bag, and not knowing when you'd see your colleagues again.
Well, Julia, though I all that does sound a bit frenetic, but I have to say, the very notion that you were monitoring the progress of the pandemic and the number of cases clearly showed a level of preparation and anticipation that I don't think most businesses, and certainly most businesses of your size here in the US, I don't think they were quite as prepared for. And I go back, I'm drawing on a fuzzy memory, but I remember getting an outreach by email from a PR firm that wanted me to participate in a survey about overall preparedness for the pandemic. And this was probably end of February, early March. So at least 10 days or so before your March 12th moment. And I remember reading it and answering the survey, and then getting the responses back and realizing that not only was I unprepared and I'd answered that way, but by and large, most of the people who responded to that survey really hadn't put any kind of tracking measure into place or contingency plans. Those all came together, I think, probably at about the time that your team was smartly packing up blue IKEA bags. A lot of companies were cranking out their computers and laptops and tablets to say, oh my gosh, what do we do now? So in one way, perhaps the preparation that you put in allowed you to be ready to focus on what does it take simply to clear out an office. I don't know if you in your own encounters have seen other examples of companies that were as on the ball as you were, but it seems to me that you were more the exception than the rule.
Well, there was a lot of chatter, I think, in the New York City startup area, because it is so easy for most digital companies to work from home that on the one hand, there was a lot of pressure to do that from employees. On the other hand, we all know it's difficult and maybe a little bit less productive in some ways. So I didn't want to do that prematurely. I also happen to be freakishly interested in pandemics and viruses of all sorts. So perhaps a little bit of influence from that. I'm reading Spillover at the moment, which is all about how viruses spill over from animals to people, should you be interested in that topic. But what we were not prepared for, we were prepared for the team to kind of work from home, but we were very much not prepared for having to kind of quickly junk all of our existing messaging, which, we were in the process of rolling out this new messaging platform, but a lot of our messaging referred to travel. Travel is a major motivator for US consumers to learn a language. It's not that easy to speak another language in America for most people. Heritage, like your wife, is another motivation, but travel is a biggie for us and one of our highest converting. And it's also, it makes for lovely creative. Travel images can be really beautiful. So we leaned heavily on travel, and it was irrelevant on March 12th. And we had to very quickly scramble and create all new creative, even on TV, radio, new scripts, new digital, new video. Like, it was a major, major effort. And it had to happen quickly.
And I think about all that was happening. And of course, you're also dealing with an adjustment to an entirely new work dynamic. And so now on top of that, you are walking back a bit from a start of 2020 plan that you walked us through at a high level, and are in a matter of days, weeks, short number of weeks, essentially cranking up all new messaging. Before we talk about how you did evolve some of that stuff, Julie, tell us honestly, when you think back to your March 13th self, what did you think was likely going to happen to demand for not just Babbel, but for the category as a result of what we were just then starting to go through?
I did not think we would have an explosion of interest in language learning. I mean, it's been astonishing. I thought that we would very quickly shed a whole lot of jobs, which we did, that we would find ourselves in a recession, which we are, and that people would instantly stop their discretionary purchases, focus on more essential or immediate needs, and we'd be struggling mightily this year. And it turns out that that's not what happened. That during this time of being cooped up at home, people did a lot of things that were very different from their normal routines. I'm sure you've seen Peloton sales are through the roof, and their participation is incredible. I think they had a live class that had 23,000 participants one day. Like, that is a lot of energy being created on those wheels. You see other classes, other learning, like things like Masterclass or LinkedIn Learning, just really having huge uptick in demand. And then the whole language learning category has done really, really well. Didn't expect people to do that. It's a perfect thing to do from home when you have the time and it's quiet. It's ideal. But it was hard to know that people would respond in such a positive way. Of course they were going to stream Netflix. We knew that would happen. And that's been huge. But a whole lot of people decided to learn a language, and that's really wonderful.
So I have a couple of questions. I guess I'd love to get the Julie Hansen, inner psychiatrist point of view on why. What do you think? Is it a matter of suddenly time availability that just happened to then create a space for this demand to grow? Was it a sort of a sense that we were all brushing up against a recognition of our mortality? Was it a longing for connections to, and maybe it's to travel or to heritage that suddenly could only be experienced virtually? What do you think is going on that suddenly, because it wasn't just as we'll find out when you get into some of what actually happened, this is an explosive phenomenon, not just an isolated thing. What do you think is going on with customers that's driving this interest, Julie?
It's a really good question. Time is super interesting. I remember we've done quite a bit of research on why do people start learning with Babbel and then stop. And one of the main reasons they give is, I don't have enough time. And we always viewed that as, well, that's not the real reason. You didn't make time because you were doing something. You have some amount of time. You just didn't devote it to language learning. And what else were you doing? And so we've done, further research to try to understand, like, what is that, and how do we elevate the importance of language learning in people who have the interest but are finding they don't have enough time. Well, they had time now. And they acted on this thing they wanted to do, which was to learn a language. So it kind of made me think maybe that time excuse was pretty legit. Um, it's also this notion, though, that so much is out of our control right now. But language learning or learning anything, improving yourself, exercising, what have you, it is under our control. We can make time for it. And if we devote ourselves to 15 minutes, half hour every day to Babbel, we will make progress. We will learn new words. We will have this control. And that's very satisfying right now, given that very few other things are under our control. So that's, I think, a factor as well. And then it just makes you feel good. You doing something for you, something that's positive. There's not a lot of things that feel good right now, and that is one that does. And the satisfaction is maybe in some ways even quicker and more incremental than working out or dieting or what have you. It takes weeks of working out to really feel like, wow, I'm stronger, I'm fitter, whatever it is. With language learning, every day you're acquiring new words, new phrases, and those are more sort of little satisfactions, instant feedback than you get from other pursuits.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm joined today by U.S. CEO of Babbel, Julie Hansen, and we're talking about the explosion of interest in self-improvement and specifically the impact on Babbel's business. Julie, when those early days of March were still with us and you were facing down what you thought would be a negative impact on the business, did you cut media spend right away?
Not at all. We continued sort of business as usual through March because it was going okay. And then as soon as we saw that there was an uptick in organic interest, we immediately increased the budgets, and it kept working, so we kept increasing. The other thing we did as quickly as possible, and it's way more work than it should be, is we gave away the product. We set up an initiative to give Babbel to students, and we don't really have a rigorous way to test for that, so it was pretty much the honor system, and there was probably some fraud, but nonetheless, we know that we gave away Babbel to hundreds of thousands of students, and that's also very satisfying because there was, I think all parents and teachers and students were really scrambling to try to figure out, how do I go from this wholly in-person experience to a completely digital experience overnight. And language learning is particularly hard when you're used to having that in-person. The teaching is maybe more important in person than some other subjects, because having the teacher hear you and correct you, and that's more important for learning how to speak a language than, I don't know, learning math. But we had to adapt. So being able to help students was a very satisfying thing.
Well, I can imagine that, and with two students at home, one a college student and one an eighth grader, I know those early days were really hectic because, as you pointed out, none of these schools nor families were prepared to completely flip the switch and go 100% virtually. It was challenging for everybody. I think, by the way, the schools have gotten a lot better about that. But just as it's very difficult to recreate a lab at home for people who are in the sciences, or as my oldest is an interior design candidate in college, she's deprived of the materials and the tools, the textiles, all of the ceramics that would otherwise be available to her if she were in person. We don't have that. We are not a studio. As I'd like to joke with everybody, it's not really a joke, is that my daughter's interior design has zero paternity in it. And so our house is no substitute for a studio. And most homes are not really ready for a language learning immersion. And so your timing was perfect. How quickly did it take for you to update the creative? You mentioned that you sort of kept things going through March. You started to see signal of interest through search. You also mentioned earlier, Julie, that you were in the process of updating the creative to adjust for things like, for example, the travel was off the table. How quickly were you able to get the new creative flighted into market?
Starting with digital assets that first week, I'd say the full rollout probably took us the better part of a month. Happily, we had already started on a new TV creative as well that was animation based and not dependent on travel. And that was done pretty quickly. And it also was very performant, which was a wonderful gamble, I guess, because we didn't know, we'd never done a creative like that before and we didn't know how it would work, but it worked well. But the full transition, email, all the websites, all the digital assets, that took the better part of a month. And of course, it's tricky when you do that because, as you know, with many algorithms, they favor the old creative that's working. So one has to carefully introduce new creative so that you don't kind of blow it up all at once, but rather, incrementally make those changes.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. Um, just a couple more questions from me, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. Um, at a high level, can you talk a bit about how the performance is improved specifically at Babbel?
It's been a wild ride. We've seen sales pretty much quadruple year over year. And part of that was you could sort of see the effect of the shelter. First of all, you could see the effect of kind of fear of COVID in early March. Things were a little soft. And then the first shelter in place took place and things started to go up. And then the kind of nationwide shelter in place up. And then, really leaning into the marketing up. So various stages to it. But basically 3 to 4x last year, and also a total defiance of seasonality. Typically in our business, we see that this part of spring is a soft period for us. May, June, not a big season for language sales. I don't know why. It should be, because if you're planning a summer trip, this would be a good time to start. But we don't typically see that. July tends to be bigger. I have no idea what to expect this July. I think by now it's don't expect anything normal is the rule for the year.
That's a perfect segue to my last question, which is, as a leader, Julie Hansen, what do you think about what's going to come next, and how are you starting to imagine planning for the business in the next 3 months ahead?
Well, there are a few factors. One of which is clearly that we are in a recession. How will that impact us? Media rates will remain lower from that. Will interest remain high? I think time will tell. But recessions can be good opportunities for market leaders to actually grow their market share. So we're looking to take advantage of that opportunity. As the lockdowns release and people go out into the world again, how will that affect language learning? It probably doesn't stimulate it. So we're prepared for maybe some softness in the organic demand. But again, who knows? I think time will tell. So there's just all these kind of factors and lots of contingency plans in either direction, and these things will interact with each other. But our current thinking is we want to be as aggressive as we can be to grow market share, during a recession. If that is possible, we will be trying.
Yes, well, not just possible. The history says that there's all kinds of examples of this having played out. This is not just a novel idea. This has been a phenomenon that's echoed from trough to trough to trough as economies invariably go through moments of contraction. Of course, this is a unique contraction, but nevertheless, as I think it was Eric Fisher, who runs a media strategy agency, said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, you don't grow market share in great times, you grow them in bad times. And if you're able, the evidence suggests if you can spend, this is a great time to do it. I want to switch over to audience questions, and we have a couple that have come in. I want to start with Lucia, who asks exactly the right question. Lucia asks, have you learned any new languages? since the start of or during the pandemic? I'll go first, and the answer is no. But I've already established that I'm a slacker through all this. Julie, how about you? Are you focusing on any language development of your own, or maybe focusing on developing a skill in other ways?
Ja, natürlich. Ich habe viele Deutsche gelernt. I've been very much more diligent about my German than I have been over the past 3 years. And it's very satisfying to have the time. My goal with German, honestly, is to be able, when I go there, because our parent company is in Germany, to be able to get around and converse with the taxi driver and in the restaurants, what have you. And then when I hear all the German speakers in the office talking, I just want to understand them. That's my goal. But no, I'm making good progress. And like a lot of our learners, actually, I've been using the desktop version of the product as much as the app. And that's also been very interesting to see how the two formats are different and the same. So I'm actually getting to know the product better as well. We did just introduce Latin American Spanish for the American market, and there's been great response to that. And I never studied Spanish, but I feel that I am, like most New Yorkers, surrounded by it. So maybe that's next, especially now that we have the sort of more relevant Spanish version for the US market.
Well, let the record reflect that we've had our first German phrase ever appear on Simulmedia Live. In fact, the first phrase in any other language aside from English. So totally appropriate that would happen in my conversation with Babbel. So thank you for that. One last question. This one comes from Thomas. Thomas wants to know, you mentioned new KPIs that you were planning for 2020. How are you measuring performance today?
Well, we've always looked at our sales in a relatively short time window. We have this notion of roughly a week that we look at our sales, against our, basically from the inception of a lead to a sale, the main measure we use is about a week. And that tends to be a very useful measure because it gives you like a rule of thumb predictor to what the total sales will be. However, we've never optimized for the total sales. So now we're taking more of a long-term view, looking at total sales. So we're still looking at the same KPIs we always did, but paying more attention to longer-term sales, less attention to short-term sales. And that's allowed us to put a greater emphasis on lead generation than we have in the past, knowing that good marketing will convert those leads over time. So variations of a theme, if you will, but for us, it's a pretty big variation, given that the Babbel New York is relatively young. We've been at this about 4 years, and we've always done it one way in those 4 years. So we're learning to do things a different way with our brand new creative all at once from home. As the WNYC says, all of it.
Well, seems like a fitting way to draw this to a close. I'll thank Thomas and Lucia for asking their questions. These shows always get better when audience asks questions that I don't think of and that doesn't come up anyway ordinarily in our conversation. So I want to thank them and thank everyone for watching today, and especially Julie, thank you for taking some time out from your very, very busy time with Babbel and with your family there in Stratton to join us on Simulmedia Live. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope you and your family and your team continue to see great success.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me back at you. It was fun to be here.
It was awesome to have you. So we're going to adjourn for today, but we have one more show this week. Tomorrow I'm going to be speaking with David Cohn, the president of the IAB, and David's going to be coming on to talk about the 7-step prescription that the IAB is drawing up to address some of the weaknesses in television advertising, including the way that television advertising is measured. And really, really excited to be speaking with David about his role, his vision, and where he sees opportunities to improve the way that we do television advertising collectively as an industry. So hope you tune in then. And we've got a whole slate of shows coming next week too. So, keep your eyes on your inbox for information on our guests that are upcoming. We've really got some great ones for you that I think you're going to be excited to hear from. So to all of you, I want to thank you again so much for joining. It means so much to me and to everyone who produces this show that you take time out to watch. We all know you're busy, and it makes our day to know that we're able to participate with you and have these conversations with you. Thanks again to our guest, Julie Hansen. Thanks to our production team behind Simulmedia Live. We will see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.